Thank you all so much for coming tonight, and welcome. I hate to say this, it's unfortunate. Welcome to our second annual California Drought Panel. I was just talking with a couple of our panelists today, and we're hoping that it's the last annual California Drought Panel, at least for the time being. But then we started talking about how much rain we would need to get between now and next March in order to be able to say that, and that's an interesting question to try to answer. So we held a similar event as last year in the midst of one of the driest periods in the state's history. And we hoped that we wouldn't have a follow-up this year, but we're now in our fourth year of drought, and there's really no plausible scenario, no likely scenario that will change that for the summer. I don't know how many of you compulsively check the water news, but there are two headlines from this week alone about the extent of the drought. The first one from today, we got the official March 1st snowpack readings, which are at historic low levels, 1 percentage point off the record low. Our Sierra snowpack is at 19% of average. Apparently in 1991 on this date it was at 18% of average, so we barely missed the record. The other comparable year is 1977, so the snowpack is at historically low levels, which bears ill news for the summer. Last year at this time, when we were in the midst of one of the driest periods in the state's history, by the way, the snowpack was at 31% of average. So in terms of snowpack, we're in worse shape than we were last year, and I think Daniel Swain will talk about why that's the case a little bit tonight. So that raises really the other piece of news from this week is that the Central Valley Project, the large federal project that provides irrigation water to a great deal of the agriculture in the Central Valley, announced that a certain category, large category of agricultural water users would get no water from the Central Valley Project this summer. They would get 0% of their allocation. The same category of irrigators who got 0% last year are getting 0% this year. The numbers for the State Water Project are a little better. The shares to municipal and agricultural users last year from the State Water Project were 5% of average annual use. And this year, the initial numbers they announced were 15%. I think they bumped that recently to 20%, so still very, very low numbers, and we're still in very bad shape, which raises a series of questions that I hope our panel tonight, I'm sure they will address to at least some degree. The first question, which is perhaps the hardest to answer, but I'll plop it right in the capable lap of Daniel Swain, is how long will the drought last? Okay, everybody wants to know, how long will the drought last, and what does it mean for the state? But the other two questions, which I hope our other two panelists will address. One is, what are we doing about the drought? That's the question I get all the time. We're having a fourth dry year. What are we going to do about it? We can't make more water. So I hope Buzz and Tom can talk about what we are doing about it, which raises an even more important question is what should we be doing about it as a state, and how does what we should be doing vary compared to what we, in fact, are doing? So I hope we'll get to all of those questions tonight. I know it'll be a great panel. Our first, just a few quick procedural points. Each panelist has a presentation that'll last about 15 minutes. If everybody takes their full time allotment, we'll have at least 45 minutes for questions. We are taping this, videoing it, so if you have questions, I hate to ask you to do this, but please go to the microphones here in the aisles, and that'll it'll pick up the audio, and we'll have the video up on our website, waterinthewest.stanford.edu, shortly. So if you missed anything, you want to see it again, or you want to recommend it for viewing to others, it will be up on that website for viewing. So our three panelists tonight, it was a great panel last year. I'm sure it'll be a great panel tonight. Our first speaker is going to be Daniel Swain. Daniel's a PhD student in Stanford. I think I have the old department name, Stanford's Department of Environmental and Earth System Sciences. You can correct the new department name if needed. Daniel studies the changing character of extreme meteorological events with a particular focus on climate change, and his recent work increasingly includes research into how climate change might be affecting the California drought in the context of historical climate variability and the potential role of climate change in affecting the likelihood of drought in California, and I'm sure he'll talk about that tonight. Many of you know Daniel in his other role as weather blogger extraordinaire. I really urge you, if you haven't, to look at Daniel's blog, weatherwest.com, which takes very highly technical information about ocean conditions and atmospheric conditions and their effect on California's weather, and boils it down into really understandable terms, and he updates it regularly. So if you're really dying to know what the next stage of the California drought is, I really recommend Daniel's website, and Daniel's particularly well known for coining the phrase ridiculously resilient ridge. And tonight maybe he'll talk about the ridiculously resilient ridge redux. So that's our first speaker, Daniel. Our second speaker is Buzz Thompson from the law school. He's the Paradise Professor of Natural Resources. Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you so much for telling me. Is that better? Okay. I'm too tall for the microphone. I apologize for that. So Buzz is a professor at the law school, and he's the Perry McCarty Director and Senior Fellow at the Woods Institute. He's one of the nation's leading experts in natural resources and water law, and has published widely on both topics. Our third speaker will be Tom Zichterman. He's the Associate Director of Water Services and Civil Infrastructure at Stanford. Tom manages the operation of Stanford's water supplies, including domestic water, surface water, wastewater, and storm drainage systems, as well as other civil infrastructure. And he's the chair of the Water Sustainable Working Group at Stanford, which is currently planning the long-term sustainable management of Stanford's water supply and demand. And tonight, Tom will talk about some of Stanford's responses to the drought, but also Stanford's long-term efforts to reduce water use and improve the sustainability of its water use. So we'll start with Daniel, and then move through the panel.
All right. Well, as you have heard in the introduction, I am going to talk about the meteorological aspects of the drought, the physical causes, the severity. I'll touch a little bit on the impacts, because those are strongly driven by what the character of the drought actually is, both in temperature and precipitation. Let's see. All right. Excellent. So the current drought is actually already the third wave of drought in California in the 21st century so far. So we've already essentially had 3 droughts in the last 15 years. And as you can see on the plot I have up on the screen, the current wave of drought is by far the most intense and already the most prolonged going into 2015. You can also see that the drought began pretty abruptly during calendar year 2012 and then persisted at roughly the same intensity through 2013, and then really sort of skyrocketed in early 2013 into 2014 and if you were in California at that time, you probably remember that's when precipitation essentially fell off a cliff. And since then, the intensity has been more or less constantly exceeding extreme to exceptional severity up to this date right now. And this is just a map of sort of the same quantity I had plotted as the time series before. And really what I want to point out here is that California is really the center of a much broader drought across the American Southwest. And that broad drought across the Southwest has persisted for much longer than the current drought event in California. But it's also true that the current drought in California is of considerably greater severity than the broader drought in the American Southwest. Many of you are probably already pretty familiar with the drought impacts throughout California. Some of the most visible of these have been in the surface water availability in California's storage infrastructure, sort of visible in these iconic pictures of low reservoir levels in Lake Oroville, Lake Shasta, Lake Folsom last summer. But I think a particularly interesting way to look at it, and maybe a little bit more objective way or a little more all-encompassing way, is to look at things from space, from Earth orbiting satellites. And when you do that, and this is the plot I have up here on the right, you see that California has lost weight during this drought, and that's all water weight. The mass of the state of California has decreased because the water that used to be here is no longer here. The water that was in the soil, the water that was stored in reservoirs, the water that was in the lakes and streams is now either in the Pacific or back in the atmosphere somewhere. And so this is a really sort of, I think, profound statement as to the sort of magnitude of the event we're talking about here, that you can see the mass loss of water from space. And further impacts, again, extreme wildfire risk, and some of the wildfires that occurred this past fall in the Sierra Nevada foothills and into the mountains and the coniferous forests there were hotter burning and faster moving than any that had been previously observed in that region. That's a direct effect of how dry the vegetation was in these really low soil moistures now for a long period of time. Another effect, the really low stream flows leading to severe environmental impacts and damage to ecological regimes and fisheries, especially in the northern part of the state. Also, snowpack, as has been alluded to already. The current snowpack is exceptionally low, and at least by some metrics is either at or even below, in many regions, the previous recorded minimum. These are two photographs that have been sent to me over the past couple of months, both on the Tioga Road either in or near Yosemite National Park. And both of these photographs were taken either at or above 8,000 feet in elevation. Can't hear? All right, I guess it's very sensitive to how close I hold this to my mouth. The photograph on the left is from January, and the photograph on the right from February. And again, my main point here is that this looks an awful lot like August. And I've actually been up there in August when there's more snow on the ground than this. So that's a pretty remarkable statement about the lack of snow really throughout the Sierra Nevadas, both not only this winter, but in the preceding winters as well. A little bit more of a data-driven way to look at this is the plot on the left shows where we are relative to average precipitation-wise for the current winter season. And you can see a lot of yellows and reds on that map, meaning that California is, once again, even for this winter, below average in the precipitation department. That actually wasn't true until recently, because we did receive some really intense, heavy, warm, wet storms, brief ones, but intense ones, both in early December and then also in February. But those have not been enough to put us above normal. In fact, now that we've had a very dry January and now also most of February, now going into early March, have been dry as well, we're falling below average. In particular, I wanted to point out, if I can figure out where well, if you look at the Sierra Nevadas, and you look particularly in that part of California, that's the reddest part of the map, and that is in fact where most of the snow water capacity resides. That's where we've seen essentially no precipitation this winter. Well, we've seen some precipitation, but it's been far below average. On the right, you see how that's the 3-year average for the same quantity, more uniformly distributed. Everyone's below average in the 3-year mean. And increasingly, the big part of this drought story in California has been these incredibly warm temperatures that we've been seeing. And 2014 was California's record warmest year by a wide margin, which is part of a long-term warming trend in the state. And the effect of this, combined with the low precipitation, means that Sierra Nevada has now reached reached the all-time record, or in some cases exceeded it. And I received some information last night from the U.S. Forest Service, and they were telling me that some of their snow pillows, which are these automated snow measurement systems they have in a few regions, some of them as high as 7,000 feet actually had no snow on them at all. So it's really quite an impressive situation up there in terms of the snowpack in the Sierra. Well, so why has it been so warm and dry in California these past few winters? Well, the culprit is what I like to call the ridiculously resilient ridge. And in the case of this winter, perhaps, the ridiculously resilient ridge has returned. If I can add another R to the alliteration there. The ridiculously resilient ridge is an unusually persistent region of atmospheric high pressure centered over the northeastern Pacific Ocean. And what that has done, the net effect of this effectively boulder in the stream, has been to deflect the jet stream, or that river of high velocity air, which usually defines the storm track, well to the north of California, into Alaska and into British Columbia. And so while those regions have been left very warm and wet, California is sort of on the downstream side of this big ridge, been sort of stuck in the warm and dry position on the eastern flank. And just to sort of drive home sort of the mechanism of this ridge and its role in driving these precipitation deficits, here again is a static representation of the same thing I was plotting on the last slide. This is the ridiculously resilient ridge over the northeastern Pacific in 2013. And the white region, just for reference, are the areas that saw higher atmospheric pressures over the course of 2013 that had previously been observed at any point in the observed record. And just for reference, that geographic region spans from central California to Kamchatka on the other side of the Pacific Basin. This persistent region of high pressure has resulted in persistent atmospheric circulation anomalies. In other words, persistent anomalous wind patterns that are highly unusual for winter. In the upper panel, you can see the fact that the storm track has shifted northward from where it would normally be west of California into Alaska. And then also that while Alaska was getting flow from the warm subtropics and getting lots of warm and wet air masses sort of pumped up there from the south, California was sort of stuck under a persistent region of flow from the cold, dry continental region up in Canada. And this has been a pattern that's sort of shifted back and forth, but in large part been in place for several years. The net effect of all of that, of course, has been to bring record low precipitation to California. This is a map depicting the regions which in 2013 received less precipitation than during any previous calendar year. Again, the white regions in California, Oregon, and parts of Idaho and also Nevada show where 2013 was the driest year on record. And the reason why the current drought is of such interest is it's now a multi-year event. And the physical cause, or at least the proximal physical cause of the drought in all of these 3 years has remained essentially locked in place. And what I just want to focus your attention to here is the big red blob, which in the first frame is sort of centered west of California over the Gulf of Alaska, and in the succeeding two frames sort of drifts eastward just west of California and then just to the north of California over the Pacific coast, including British Columbia and the Pacific Northwest. This is the ridiculously resilient ridge in 3 consecutive years. And it has been essentially locked in place now for 3 consecutive winters. And in all 3 of those positions, even though they're slightly different from winter to winter, it's been highly effective at blocking the Pacific storm track and preventing precipitation from reaching California like it normally would during the winter months. And what's interesting to note is that as it has shifted slightly eastward over the past couple of winters, we have been able to, in the instance of this winter, a couple of particularly warm and wet storms have been able to sneak in on the west side of the ridge and bring some brief but intense precipitation to California. You may remember again that early December storm, or the one we had in February, where there's just 1 or 2 days of really intense precipitation sort of followed by extended dry spells on either side of it. That's sort of been the characteristic pattern we've been seeing for these past couple of winters. And in a broader historical sense, what is the role of big ridges in the atmosphere in this particular part of the world? Well, in the context of what matters for California, this is the pattern to look for when you're thinking about drought in California. And this is just a map depicting what the atmospheric pressure patterns looked like during all of the years that were dry in California's observed history. And in fact, the ridiculously resilient ridge pops out very prominently in exactly the region in which it's been so seemingly permanently locked these past couple of years. And again, just to drive home the point about why a ridge in this particular region is so characteristic of drought in California and the implications of drought, these animations are depicting the seasonal cycle of the jet stream and of precipitation in California, precipitation on the bottom and the jet stream on the top. And as you can see, in terms of the precipitation cycle in California, we have a very strongly seasonal cycle that's tied to winter. That is to say, California receives almost all of its precipitation during the cool season and has a very dry summer, which is, for various climatological regions, actually kind of a rare pattern, globally speaking, and even regionally, because you can see that the adjacent states, for example, have a summer rainy season in Arizona and places where you're influenced by the North American monsoon. But in any case, the primary thing I want to show here is that there's a seasonal cycle in the jet stream, and during the winter months, it strengthens and shifts southward, south and west of California. And that strengthening and southward shift of the jet stream is what allows storm systems to move into California from the north and west during the winter season and bring us our typical precipitation. That hasn't been happening to the same degree as it normally would these past few years, because instead of having this jet stream oriented to our west and strengthening during the winter, we've actually had it shifted well to the north. And so this persistent ridging event has prevented the jet stream from taking its normal trajectory from the west into California, and therefore prevented the amount of precipitation from falling that we might normally have seen. And so just to talk a little bit, and I'd be happy to talk more afterward in the question section about sort of how things are changing over time in California, and in fact there are large changes over time. This is a figure from a paper that our research group published just this week. And the first thing I want to point out, and again, just to orient everyone, you can sort of ignore, there's a lot of information on this plot, but you can ignore everything except that on the vertical axis is temperature and the horizontal axis is precipitation. 2014 really stands out, both separately in terms of how warm it was and how dry it was, but also especially when you look at those two variables together, 2014 sticks out like a sore thumb. it's way out there in the upper left quadrant of that graph. And the other thing I wanted to point out here is that almost all of the recent years have been dry, and that's something, sorry, almost all the recent years have been warm, and that's something that you can see in the panel on the right. And many of those recent years have also been dry, and so therefore the preponderance of years in the last 20 years has been both warm and dry. And in fact, that particular aspect of California's changing climate over time has led to a large increase in the risk of temperature-driven droughts in California. In fact, when you look at most of the major, or actually all of the major drought indicators for California over the observational period, which goes back to the late 1800s, you see that there is in fact a robust temperature-driven trend towards increased drought in California. And that is occurring despite the fact that there isn't a huge change in the average annual precipitation in California. We have seen a cluster of very dry years recently, but in the long-term trend, there isn't that much to talk about. So what's interesting is that this trend in drought in California really is being driven by the long-term trend in temperature, which, as you saw earlier, is quite substantial. And I can talk a little bit more about this if people are interested, but that long-term trend in California temperature can directly be tied to global warming. And the other point I wanted to make here is that this current event, 2014, falls way down at the bottom of the chart. In fact, the first time I plotted this, before it included January's data, the bottom axis only went to -4. So this really has been an outlier, and it's been a particularly severe event, even in the context of the major droughts that we've had over the past 100 years in California. And I guess I just wanted to close this short introduction with just a very short-term outlook. This is not a climate projection. This is more like something I would have up on the weather blog, but this is an outlook just for the next week or so. And once again, we are locked into a pattern with a big western ridge, very little to no precipitation in California, and again, unusually warm conditions. Looks like highs in the 70s this week in Palo Alto. Does not really feel like March, but February didn't really feel like February, and arguably January didn't feel like January either. And with that, I'll close this quick introduction, and I guess questions will come later. But I'll also point out, again, as was mentioned earlier, if you're interested in California weather and or climate or the drought or any combination thereof, feel free to visit the California Weather blog. All right.
I'll take that.
Yeah.
Okay, you picking this up at all? I tend to be really loud, and so I'm not even sure I need the microphone, except for purposes of the people who are watching this on the internet. So I'll try to continue to talking as loud as I possibly can. Well, normally I start out by saying I'm delighted to be here this evening. And to be able to talk to you about water issues. But the truth of the matter is, I'm not delighted to be here this evening. I was hoping that here in the year 2015, we would have broken this particular drought. But unfortunately, we are, as people have already mentioned, in the 4th year of this particular drought. And although there are some things that are encouraging in this particular year, on the whole, I think the year looks very much like the year that we just experienced. So the precipitation index in California is actually a little bit higher than it was last year. And Daniel talked about this earlier. It has rained more in this particular year. In the Sacramento Valley, the area of the Central Valley north of Sacramento, the precipitation index stands at 88%. The amount of precipitation that we've received in the Sacramento Valley this year is greater than the precipitation that we received in all of 2014. So that's a good sign. But unfortunately, as you go south in California, the precipitation index actually drops. And so if you look at the San Joaquin Valley, which is a portion of our Central Valley south of Sacramento, the precipitation index right now is only at about 50%. And when you get down to Southern California and the Los Angeles and the Inland Valley area, we actually are in a very serious drought situation at the moment. Because of the fact that the precipitation index has been a little bit higher than last year in Northern California, a lot of our major reservoirs, again, look much better this year. So Shasta, for example, which is a major reservoir for us, the largest reservoir, it has about 58% of the water that it can hold. In a normal year, though, that's 78%. So we're still significantly below the amount of water that we would typically find in our major reservoirs. And in fact, the best total that I've been able to come up with makes it seem like we have about 5 million acre-feet less water in our reservoirs right now than would normally be in those reservoirs. And for those of you who are not used to dealing with acre-feet, an acre-foot, I find, is generally the amount of water. You can assume that an acre-foot is the amount of water that a family of about 5 people needs over the course of an entire year. So if we're down 5 million acre-feet, that means we're basically down enough water to meet the needs of 5 million family homes over the course of a year. Even worse than that, and I'll come back to this in a moment, if you look at the amount of groundwater that we have available now versus how much groundwater we had available a year ago, we have used up about 6 million acre-feet of our groundwater over the course of the last year. And groundwater, as I will again point out in a moment, is incredibly important. And then finally, you get to the snowpack that Leon mentioned earlier. That's at 19% of average right now. As Leon pointed out, the only year that was worse than that as of March 1st was 1977, a year I hoped I would never see the likes of again. I'm sorry, it was actually 1991. 1977, which is almost as bad, was actually at about, let's see here, at this particular point in time, about 25%. So we're actually much worse than that. But 1991, another really dry year, was about a percent lower as of this point in time. But 1991 was the year of the March miracle rainfalls. It basically rained all of March. And so far, that doesn't look like it's going to be the picture that we're going to see this March. So my guess is we'll actually set a record this year for the lowest possible snowpack. So again, things look really bad this year. And the unfortunate thing about that is that, of course, they were bad last year. Last year was the first year since 1977 that the state of California had to order junior appropriators in the state of California to stop taking water. In a normal year, we have enough water to meet all of the needs of all of our various water users. But as I said, first time in 40 years that we had to order the junior appropriators to stop taking water. And you can see that in this dry irrigation ditch. Our two major water systems in California for distributing water are the State Water Project, which takes water from takes water from Lake Oroville here, brings it down into the Central Valley, and then down in Southern California. Last year in the State Water Project, we delivered 5% of average deliveries. This year, as Leon pointed out, that'll probably be a little bit higher. We're estimating about 20%. The other major project is the Central Valley Project, which stores water way up here in Lake Shasta, brings water down again, and delivers it largely here in the Central Valley area. Last year, farmers got 0%, as Leon mentioned. This year, it's also likely to be 0%. Now, how did we fare last year in terms of meeting the needs of urban water users, agricultural water users, and fish with that very low amount of water that we had available? Well, urban users actually got along, on the whole, pretty well. And that was for a variety of reasons. Number one, in Southern California had prepared for this particular drought. And they had constructed a number of reservoirs, such as the Diamond Valley Lake Reservoir that you see in this particular picture, to store up water over time so that the water would be available in a drought year like we saw last year. Diamond Valley Reservoir holds about 800,000 acre-feet of water. And last year, it was started the year pretty much full, really helped Southern California make it through the drought. This year, unfortunately, right now, I think Diamond Valley Reservoir has about 18% of the water that it had a year ago. So a great way of getting through the drought last year. It's going to be a little bit tougher this year. A second way in which the urban areas got through the drought last year was through conservation. As you all know, Governor Brown a year ago asked us to conserve 20% over what we had used the year before. We didn't start out very well. A month after he made that request, we actually looked at how much people were conserving. It actually turned out that people were using more water than they had used the year before. But we got serious about that particular point. And this shows the amount of conservation in various areas of the state. Here's the San Francisco Bay Area, compared to how much water was being used in 2013 versus in 2014 for the period of June to November. And you can see in the Bay Area, we should feel pretty good. We didn't meet Governor Brown's goal, but we reduced our use by 17%. And we were much better than the state as a whole that only reduced its use by about 9%. In December, that number got even better. For the state as a whole, we actually saved 22% of water compared to in 2013. And that, again, really helped us get by with a dry winter. Unfortunately, the most recent statistics that were released 2 days ago show that we have gotten back into our bad habits. And for January of this year, we were only down by about 9%. So we are, again, not meeting the governor's goals for water conservation. Now, that combination of storage and water conservation helped most urban areas get through the drought last year. But not all urban areas were that lucky. In particular, coastal areas that had no major source of water except for local precipitation had a hard time getting through the drought last year. And poorer areas, particularly in the San Joaquin Valley, poorer areas that were largely dependent upon groundwater also had major problems. This is a picture of the distribution of Crystal Geyser bottled water to the residents of Porterville, which is a large, rural, relatively poor community sort of north of Bakersfield. And because of the amount of groundwater that we were using last year, the groundwater tables dropped to a point where the local residents who were getting water from their own wells could no longer get water. Their wells went dry. And imagine what it is like if you have a home that depends upon well water and you have no well water whatsoever. You can get Crystal Geyser water to drink, but how do you take baths? How do you take showers? How do you use the indoor plumbing in your house at all? Because you are basically getting no water whatsoever. So again, there were hundreds of households in the Central Valley in this particular position. Now, some communities that were in this type of very dry situation resorted to other ideas. So Cambria, which is an area where Hearst Castle is, they built their own desalination plant. And it was sort of an interesting idea behind a desalination plant. Rather than taking ocean water, which is very expensive to desalinate, they have a problem in this particular area that because of groundwater overdrafting for years, the groundwater here, which is next to the coast, is highly saline, and therefore you can't use it for domestic purposes. They had the idea, well, rather than pumping water out of the ocean, why don't we pump water out of that saline groundwater well? It's not as salty as the ocean, therefore it doesn't cost as much to desalt that particular water. And so what they did was they would pump the water out of this brackish source. They would then pull out that brine, and then they would come over here and they would pump that desalinated water back into the ground and then let it actually naturally move over to this area where they would pump it out again. And it's actually a fairly effective system. It wasn't that expensive. They did have one problem, though, which is what do you do with the brackish water? Desalination has a whole variety of problems. Normally it's too expensive. This one was a little bit less expensive. But the second thing is, what do you do with all of that salt brine that you are left with at the end of the process? So they haven't actually figured out that particular problem. What they have done instead is to build a huge pond here where they are just storing up all of that salt brine until they figure out what they can do with that particular salt brine. So interesting idea, doesn't quite make it. Agriculture, historically agriculture could have gotten by with a year or two of drought. You just fallow your fields in those particular years. That's much more difficult to do now because we have much more permanent crops in California than we did 10 or 20 years ago. About a third of all of our crops in California are either fruit or nut trees on the one hand, or they are grapevines on the other. This is very profitable, even though it's only about a third of our agricultural acreage in California. It actually takes in about 2/3 of the income. But the problem with permanent crops is that you have to water them virtually every year, because if you don't water them, they're going to die, and there goes your capital investment in your agricultural fields. So how did agriculture get through the last year? They resorted to groundwater. And in fact, if you take the total amount of surface water that agriculture was cut back, they made up for about 75% of that by pumping groundwater. The problem, however, is, as Daniel pointed out earlier, that leads to a huge overdrafting of our groundwater aquifers. We lost, as I mentioned earlier, about 6 million acre-feet of groundwater last year. It lowers the groundwater table, which means those people in Porterville can no longer actually pump water out of their groundwater wells, and it has a whole variety of other potentially adverse consequences, including subsidence of the surface, and if you're talking about groundwater aquifers near the coast, the possibility of saltwater intrusion. Now, although that's not a good story, it does have one silver lining, which was that the problem was serious enough last year that for the first time, California decided it would adopt statewide groundwater management legislation. This is a picture of Jerry Brown signing the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act of 2014, which, as I'll come back to in a few minutes, actually requires the state for the first time to manage its groundwater on a sustainable basis. Okay, finally, fish. Okay, I don't have a happy story about fish. Fish couldn't rely upon the groundwater. Fish can't conserve. Fish can't store up water over time. So here are two particularly sensitive species. The Delta smelt is up here at the top. Down here is the longfin smelt. And what these lines show is the number of smelt that we've been able to find each year. And what you'll see is that they've been in a general decline anyway, but look at this period of drought since 2011. And you can see that basically there are no Delta smelt out there right now, nor are there any longfin smelt. Now, if you're not a smelt lover, then the other tragic story last year were Chinook salmon. The water during the spring, when the salmon like to migrate out to the ocean, was so low that we basically had to bust them back to the ocean. But the probably most tragic statistic is that last year, about 95% of the 2014 Chinook offspring died because of the overly warm water. And that's an important point to emphasize, that fish are threatened not only by low amounts of water, but also by high temperature water. And of course, they are highly correlated. Okay, so what should we do? And let me just run through sort of my favorite list right now, some of the things we need to start doing. The first thing is we need a system where we actually have better statistics about water. Throughout much of the state, we don't meter our water so that we actually don't know how much a lot of people actually use in the way of water. We don't have real-time gauges that tell us how much water is actually in our rivers and streams. We could be using more effective models for figuring out what the current weather is likely to mean in terms of the amount of water available later. Imagine if you were running a bank, okay, and all of your employees told you that we had no idea how much money was actually in the bank. We didn't have any idea how much money people were withdrawing from the bank, okay? That is maybe a bit of an extreme analogy, but it is not too far off the truth of our ability to actually manage water today in California. The second thing is that we do need to continue to come up with new storage facilities. And thankfully, last year we passed Proposition 1, which is providing about $2.7 billion to help us in constructing storage. Problem is that a lot of us are thinking about using that money for surface storage. And the truth of the matter is that new surface storage would be very expensive. And in addition to being expensive, even if we built the major surface reservoirs that we're talking about in the Central Valley today, it would only increase the total amount of storage in California by about 7%, and it would only increase the amount of water available in a typical year by 1%. And the other problem with storage is it doesn't work unless you have water to store. And if you're in a fourth year of a drought, then frequently you don't have the water that you actually need to store. One of the things that makes as much sense, maybe more sense than building more surface storage, is actually storing water in those groundwater aquifers that we have dewatered in the past. It can be less expensive, and we actually have vast amounts of underground storage capacity that we could be utilizing today. To be able to utilize that underground storage, though, we have to effectively implement that 2014 Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. And I've just put up here the timeline for that. In 2 years, we're supposed to determine who's going to actually be managing our groundwater. We're supposed to come up with plans for managing our groundwater by the year 2022. But unfortunately, it's not until 2040 that we actually have to have sustainable groundwater aquifers. And so one of the things that we have to be doing is trying to advance that deadline and really managing our groundwater effectively. And one of the things that we're doing here at Stanford, through things such as our Groundwater Dispute Resolution Workshop, is to come up with a system for doing that. Another thing we have to do is we have to have more effective water markets in California. That permits people who don't have the water to actually acquire the water from people who might be able to get by with water, with less water in a particular year. We do have relatively good water markets in California, but they could still be even better. There's still very many legal barriers to those water markets. And furthermore, by coming up with some additional conveyance infrastructure, we might be able to move the water around the state more effectively. If we have effective water markets, that also might be able to help us with the fish. This is a picture of the Scott River Water Trust, which is an example of an environmental water trust that actually buys water and puts it in the river for fish. And even though it was a dry year last year, the Scott River Water Trust was able to acquire some water early in the year to help the fish in that particular area. But we have to go beyond simply buying water for the fish. There's several of us who proposed about a year ago that because fish always seem to lose in a drought, that we actually give fish the amount of water that they are normally entitled to in a year. And if, as a result of a drought, we decide to reallocate the water, that's fine. We can reallocate the water to, help people. But if we do that, we should pay the fish for the water that we're taking away from them so that we can use that money to protect their habitat in other ways which will hopefully counterbalance the fact that we're taking water away from them. We should also conserve. Stanford, I hope Tom covers this in a moment, has actually been doing an experiment that I'm participating in where I now have a smart water irrigation controller for my house. So when it rains, it automatically turns itself off. It also gets weather information from the Stanford station and uses that to adjust the amount of water that it actually needs. And I've actually been following how much water I've been using on my property. And this actually has been significantly reducing the amount of water that's being utilized. Finally, what did I do wrong there? There we go. The other thing that we should be doing is charging people the real cost of their water. So there's a reason to conserve. I'm just going to rush through these final things, which is we're on the verge of new technologies that can help us to actually obtain water that is more reliable in the course of a drought. One of them is water recycling that we're testing here on the Stanford campus, which not only would recycle water, which is much more reliable in a period of drought, recycle water and produce energy at the same time. There's also experimentation going on with graphene membranes, which should be able to reduce the cost of desalination, and desalination is another drought-proof source of water. The problem, however, is that because the price of water is so low in California and the rest of the United States, that we actually get very little in the way of this type of technological innovation in the water field. I'm just going to leave you with this. This shows the amount of technological innovation in energy from 1999 till today. That's the amount of technological innovation in water. If we raise the price of water, we could get a lot more innovation, and that innovation can help us through droughts such as this nature. So those are just a couple of ideas, and with that, I've spoken for too long, and I'm going to hand things over to Tom.
Okay, so these gentlemen cover a broad area, and I'm going to kind of bring it home to what we're doing here at Stanford. We have several water systems at Stanford, but just for context, I know I covered some of this a year ago, but just to cover it again for some of you who haven't been here before, we're located, of course, in the Bay Area, and interesting, we're kind of at the periphery of the Santa Clara Valley, and otherwise known as Silicon Valley. We have a unique topographic situation here with our Stanford lands. We have to look at our water in several categories. Not only do we have imported water from San Francisco's system, we have our own local surface water, we have groundwater, we also have a recycled water system, and water that we don't want to bring in but get rid of, wastewater and stormwater. These systems establish themselves in 5 systems that I manage with our group. Domestic water is our potable group. Every city has that. Water districts have that. But we're unique in that we have a lake water, as we'll call it, a non-potable system that we use for irrigation. We also have recycled water, sanitary sewer, and storm drainage. These are 5 separate piping systems. They're not connected. Our potable water comes from San Francisco, from the San Francisco system in the Sierra Nevada mountains. Very pristine system. We're very privileged to have it. All the way across the Central Valley, and of course, and across and around the bay up to the peninsula, on up to San Francisco. We happen to be able to tap off of that system because those major pipelines go right through our foothills. Those pipelines are tapped into by our reservoirs, and we feed our campus by gravity from those foothills reservoirs down to the campus. So we're fortunate not to have to pump to pressurize our system. It's all by gravity, fed by these major San Francisco lines. Here's a picture of our reservoir 2, our newest reservoir, about 6 million gallons of storage. These aren't elevated storage tanks. They're nestled in the topography of the foothills. That works out really well, particularly in earthquake country. Our wells supplement our San Francisco potable water. The university, like much of the peninsula, was on wells before the San Francisco system came in. We still have these wells. This is one of our newer wells, and they're kind of covered in the San Francisco Creek area of campus. Because of our 8,000 acres of acreage, we're privileged to have these creeks running through our property. And we have long established water rights that enable us to take water from these creeks. These were acquired in the early days of Stanford, even before the university. So our lake water sources, as we call it, are impounded creek water. Searsville Dam impounds water from incoming creeks to Searsville. Felt Reservoir is an offstream impoundment, getting water from Los Trancos Creek, which we divert to Felt through a flume. These reservoirs impound water, and we pipe water from those reservoirs all the way down to campus and irrigate the campus, the golf course, and all the athletic fields with that water. It's a picture of Searsville Dam. Not a recent picture, but when it does spill, that's what it looks like. And Felt Dam is an earthen reservoir and dam up here in the foothills as well. We also have a recycled water system. We don't yet recycle domestic wastewater, black water. We recycle industrial process wastewater, and that is run through a microfiltration plant, and we now currently serve about 20 buildings on campus They're dual plumbed so that the plumbing water supply to their toilets is separate from the rest of the water plumbing in the building. And we send this treated, disinfected, recycled water to these buildings. Just a little bit of history. So you can see from this graph that we were on wells until the 1960s. When we got onto the San Francisco system, our well use for potable water purposes, of course, plummeted, and our use of San Francisco water escalated. We really loved that water when it came in the 60s and 70s. We used that water so much and we decreased our well usage so much that our well's groundwater table was able to recover substantially in the decade or two following that great reduction in use. So that's really good. This is what we want to do with groundwater. Let it recover, let it stabilize at shallower depths. What happened in the use of the San Francisco water in the 70s and 80s escalated to the point where we reached the 3 million gallons a day allocation that we have from San Francisco. We were using so much San Francisco water for irrigation that we reached our allocation. And so things had to change, and they did. What happened is that Stanford's, my predecessors, returned a lot of the irrigation, particularly the golf course and the athletic fields, the big areas of lawn, back onto our lake water system and took it off the Hetch Hetchy system, which enabled our potable water, our San Francisco water system use to go down. And that kept going down until even into the 1990s, when we started realizing that we need to do even more to reduce our demand because of the growth of the campus. You know how much this campus has been growing since at least 2000 and even before that. So we embarked on a program of water conservation, retrofitting many of the fixtures throughout campus to low flow, and other kinds of water processes, water-intensive processes have been made much more efficient through circulation, that we were able to reduce our domestic water use substantially on the campus and actually take it down quite a bit. We returned a lot of the irrigation on campus, golf course, the big areas, to lake water. What's left on domestic is some parts of the campus and the faculty staff subdivision. We don't have this parallel non-potable water system there yet. And that's alluding to something that we're looking at doing in the future. That will really help when we get that non-potable water system to that part of campus. But most of the campus now is on this non-potable system. So we're irrigating with non-potable water and saving, preserving that San Francisco pristine water for more consumptive purposes. As you can see here, our domestic water use has then therefore declined. Our lake water irrigation has been pretty stable. Even though we've been building a lot on campus, you can see the red line of the amount of constructed footage, square footage on the campus. Our domestic water use has declined because of all this retrofitting, conserving that we've been able to implement. So looking at the future, where do we go from here? We've taken our water use down quite a bit, our potable water use, but the campus is going to continue to grow, like California. So we're going to have to project an increase in that domestic water demand, but with continuing conservation, we can offset that growth somewhat. But we do have another big opportunity to reduce our domestic water use, and that's with a new energy plant that's coming on in about a month. It's finishing construction right now. Here's a picture I showed a year ago of the energy plant under construction. Here's what the plant looks like today. This is an aerial photo. This plant is staffed now and about ready to go online. Much of its operational facilities are already starting up. This is what it looks like from the street level. So this plant is ready to start up. What it will do is, because our energy plant before used about 1/4 of all of our domestic water, this new plant with its inherent energy recovery systems is going to be much more efficient. And by the way, it's not going to use cooling towers to produce chilled water anymore. It's going to reduce the energy plant's domestic water use by about 70%. So that'll save overall 15% of our domestic water demand, starting in about 3 weeks when this thing fires up. So we're pretty excited about this Stanford Energy System Innovations, SESI plant coming on to not only help us be a lot more energy efficient and produce a lot less greenhouse gas emissions, because we're not going to be burning natural gas to generate electricity anymore. We're going to be buying it from mostly sustainable sources, renewable sources. That this plant will also save us a lot of water. So that's kind of a nice story to be able to tell. All of these sources of water are San Francisco imported water. We have a 25-year contract that we just renewed that takes us out to 2034. We've studied groundwater on campus. We can increase our groundwater pumping beyond what we've been doing the last 30 or 40 years. We have a real good alluvial fan from San Francisco Creek to pump groundwater from. And it is our potable water backup to Hetch Hetchy. But it's also normally used for our lake water system to supplement creeks, which has really paid off the last couple of years particularly. Surface water, like the Searsville study, as you may have heard about, is being intensively studied right now to see what to do about it. Stormwater capture, well, we used to think about that more than we do lately because we haven't seen a lot of storms. This is a tough climate to do stormwater capture in anyway because we get so few storms in such a small part of the year. But we're going to look at that and keep looking at that as a possible alternative water source. Recycled water, we are working with Civil Environmental Engineering to put in a research facility of treatment processes on black water, sewage, to see if we can treat those, that black water to a level that is much better than conventional treatment plants are doing, so that we would not have the concerns that we do about sewage now with personal care product residues, pharmaceutical residues remaining in that treated wastewater, that we can get those out adequately to be able to return that recycled water back to campus, maybe use it for irrigation, not just for toilet flushing, but maybe for irrigation as well eventually. So all that's being researched now over the next few years with a facility being constructed now. And by the time we get that treatment research done in a few years, hopefully we'll see a lot of progress in those capabilities and be able to think about long-term, can we use recycled water a lot more than we are now on the campus? All of those water supplies, water demands, alternative water sources can then be put together, hopefully later this year, into a long-term sustainable water management plan for the university. So what about the drought? Obviously, the Sierra snowpack is low. Our reservoirs are right now around half full. The San Francisco reservoirs are about half full. Last year, they were about 70% full this time of year. Local creek diversions are low. We basically didn't divert from Searsville for the last year and a half, almost 2 years now, because of the flows being so low. Groundwater recharge doesn't happen when it doesn't rain. Now, groundwater is the bank that we want to go to in droughts, but we have to offset that with recharge during the average and above average rainfall years. So we got to look at how much can we sustainably pump groundwater long term. So we know we've recovered groundwater a lot, but maybe could we pump a little bit more, particularly in droughts, and not have too much of an impact on the groundwater table. We have little runoff to capture in droughts, and of course irrigation demand goes up. Not because it's only because it's warmer, but because there are more months of the year when you have to irrigate. Our water use went up in January, not because it was warm, it wasn't summer yet, but it was dry. So people didn't want their grass and their plants to die. So irrigation started coming on again in January. We normally have irrigation systems off. As was mentioned before, the state has enacted drought regulations. The State Water Resources Board came out last July with some measures which really get at not wasting water. Let's get rid of the wasting of water that we do. So these measures get at that. Santa Clara County recently passed an ordinance that does similar kinds of restrictions, getting people to behave better and being more efficient about water. What have we done? Well, we have already done since the late 1990s a lot to conserve water, reduce demand. That's good, but we have to do more, even with a new energy plant coming online. These demand reductions not only are good during the drought, but if we do things like retrofitting fixtures, that carries on during normal rainfall periods too. These are permanent reductions, so those are really good for sustainability and long-term demand reduction. The campus fountains are off. They went off about a year ago. They're not back on. They're going to stay off for quite a while. We've improved efficiency in a lot of our irrigation systems and our plumbing systems, looking for leaks, fixing leaks. We've got a lot more ability, as Buzz explained about his house, his smart meter, finding where people are watering or using water when they shouldn't be. Well, why was your water running so much at 2 o'clock in the morning? Somebody didn't reset your irrigation. Somebody forgot to fix a toilet. All those kinds of things are being watched and detected a lot more than they have been in the past. We're getting smarter about controlling water. We're going to continue and accelerate these retrofits in the places we can. We've done a lot of campaigning. A lot of the students are on board with the sensitivity to water availability and competing actually for using less water. Just a few facts about retrofitting. We've done a lot of retrofitting of fixtures. We really stepped it up in 2014. You can see the bottom line numbers there about how much more we did of retrofitting. Smart controllers, these are coming on the market more and more. We're trying them out in several faculty, staff, residents, and that program is going to continue and expand. A lot of this campaigning outreach will continue and intensify this year as we see yet another year of the need to conserve even more. So we have a whole sustainability office that works with students, works with us, works with various groups, our big water user groups like athletics, R&DE, to try to get all of this water conscientiousness and behavior change going to reduce water use. So one of the things we did about websites, letting people know about how much water they're using really has an effect. If you can see not how much water you used last month, and boy, what a bummer that I have to pay more for my water in January than I planned on. If I can see how much water I used last week or yesterday, that'll help me be more responsive quicker to my excessive water use and maybe kind of turn it down a little bit. Maybe watering your grass twice a week isn't all that bad. Maybe it'll work. That kind of sensitivity comes with more information. And so we're getting a lot more data out to people about that. These graphs have been shown before. We really did pretty well on campus. Our San Francisco domestic water use, excluding a hospital connection, we had to serve the hospitals some Stanford water. Normally they're fed by Palo Alto. We took that out. And the new energy plant had to fill those big thermal storage tanks. So we said, okay, let's not count that. But overall, the rest of us, the way we normally use water, we took our water use down 7% last year compared to 2013. So that was pretty good, thinking about all the conserving and retrofitting we had already done, particularly. The Bay Area also did pretty well. By the time the realities kicked in after the governor's announcement in January, February, and March, and then the state board's actions in the middle of the year, the Bay Area really, that bottom line came out pretty well as far as trying to make a pretty good effort at reducing water use in the Bay Area. So our water supplies. San Francisco water kept about the same. These years are offset from the calendar years a little bit, so the numbers are a little different. Our creeks and lakes really plummeted last year, not much diversion. Our wells really had to escalate in use to make up for that lack of surface water diversion that we were able to do. But overall, you can see our water, this should actually read 2013, 14, is less and less each year. So we're doing better. We got to do even more, but we're doing pretty well in reducing our use year to year. So what are we going to do for 2015? The new energy plant's reduction is really great, 15%, just like that, because coincidentally we're finishing an energy plant that'll use a lot less water. That's really good. But we're going to intensify a lot of these efforts about retrofitting, irrigation, getting people data about their water use more quickly and more of them, and a lot of these campaigns and competition events to try to get people more sensitive to it. And I've got some blanks here because right now, our group, the water conservation group that I have, is looking at what else can we do and how bad is it going to be. We already know it's going to be pretty bad. In January, I heard that February was going to be a wetter than normal February. We were going to get more water than normal. That didn't pan out. Now they're saying March is going to be drier than normal. I'm hoping they're wrong again, and March turns out to be wetter. But even if it is, we've got so far to catch up now that we're going to have to figure on being very conscientious about our water. It's too late to catch up to be comfortable. So that's what we're going to be looking at for 2015. In about a month, we'll roll out a more formalized program as to what else is coming this year, what else can Stanford do, what all can our constituencies do to try to get a handle on it. So that's what Stanford's doing.
So please let us know if you can't hear. We've got a different microphone system down here. You all have been extremely patient. So I think we'll just go straight to questions from the audience.
Hi. First, I'd like to announce March 23rd is the Silicon Valley Water Conservation Awards. I invite everyone to attend. Stanford, I think, is in the running for one of the awards. You can learn more at waterawards.org. But I have a question about California's Constitution is pretty specific about water waste and wasteful methods of water use. As technology advances, especially in irrigation and plant species and home appliances, how do laws and policies keep up, and which agency should be doing this?
Okay. So the background on this particular question is that the California Constitution has a provision that was added in the 1920s that limits everyone's use of water to the amount of water that they can put to reasonable and beneficial use, and explicitly bans people from making an unreasonable use of water. And in particular, for using an unreasonable amount of water. And the question is, as new technologies come along, how does that get incorporated into these particular provisions? I think the answer is not very well. In theory, what is a reasonable amount of water to use should change over time. And it should change based both on the technologies that are available to save water, and then in addition to that, it should change based on what the other needs of water are. So if, for example, fish need more water than they did before because we are already taking so much water out, then it might very well be that what is a reasonable amount of water to take out that particular point would change. The two groups that are responsible for enforcing that provision are the state courts and the State Water Resources Control Board. State Water Resources Control Board is paying more attention to this requirement than they were in the past, but it's tough politically to step in and tell people that they have to use less water. That's why, even though we're in the middle of a drought, Governor Brown this year just urged us to reduce our water use by 20%. So the state board has used that provision to cut down on the amount of waste that is occurring, but we could probably be using that provision to reduce the amount of water that people use by an even higher percentage.
A couple of questions. First, we talked a lot about conservation, how to better manage the water that exists, and that's fine. But with California growing and new houses coming in and population growing, the demand is going to go up. So the problem is you need more water. Okay? Now, no one seems to address how we're going to get more water. So that'll be my second part of my question. But the other one is, how severe is the drought? Most of the charts I saw went back 100 to 150 years, but there's tree ring data that goes back hundreds of years, several hundred. So I don't know how unusual this drought is over a period of maybe 500-600 years. Maybe we've had periods like this in the past that are just as severe. So this is something that's sort of normal in the overall cycle of things.
Yeah. So while I let Daniel address the second part of your question, and then Tom can address the first part.
All right, well, I guess I'll start with the second part. Let's see if this is on. So it's a good question about where this current drought falls in the context of the climate variability over periods longer than the observational record. And this is one of the big challenges in climate science in general, is that we only have a direct observational record in a lot of places for 100 or 200 years. But as you point out, we do have these proxy records that go back much further than that. In many cases, hundreds of years, in some cases even thousands of years or more. And specifically, even tree rings, you brought up the dendrochronological record, which is we can literally ascertain information about what's going on with temperature and precipitation from trees that have been around for a long time. And as it turns out, there was actually a recent study specifically looking at the magnitude of the current California drought in the dendrochronological record, looking at actually oak trees in the southern two-thirds of the state. And the big finding there was when you look at the combined severity of the really warm temperatures and the really low precipitation that have occurred in California, that the current event is the most severe in at least the last millennium. So that sort of gives a sense of the magnitude of both the combined magnitude of temperature and precipitation. Of course, if you go back far enough, you probably can find events of similar magnitude. But I think that gives some relative sense of just how severe the event is in the context of things. And the other point too is California has certainly seen dry periods before in terms of low precipitation, dry years, and dry multi-year periods. There's distant proxy record evidence for what these so-called mega droughts that last for decades. But the short-term intensity of the current drought is something that is really what matters sort of on a human timescale, on what we care about with all these management decisions and what's going on with groundwater on the time scale of human lifespans, and certainly on the time scale of political decisions, are these droughts that are short and intense, sort of in the way that this one has been. And I would also add that the current temperature trend in California is something that we haven't seen in far more than a millennium. So that's something that's actually even rarer. And so the role of temperature in creating conditions conducive to these severe drought conditions is becoming increasingly apparent.
And then on your question of growth, I guess I would make maybe 3 different points. The first one is that I think we do have to pay more attention to the impact of growth on our water supplies than we historically have. For decades, the policy of water suppliers in California was the land use planners figure out how big the city is going to grow, and whatever the land use planners decide, we will get water for them. I think we need to start thinking about water supply and land use planning together. And water managers and land use planners need to work together and figure out what the actual carrying capacity of a region is and make sure they don't exceed it. Second thing, though, is the truth of the matter is that in our domestic water use, we still have an awful lot of opportunity for conserving and making new water available. We still have significant opportunities for conservation. As Tom pointed out, the Stanford campus has grown dramatically over the last several decades, and yet we actually use less water today than we did before. We can begin recycling more water. We only recycle about 11% of all of our wastewater in the state of California. There is immense opportunity there. And if things get bad enough, we can desalinate, but I would put desalination at the very bottom because of the various costs involved in desalination. And then the third thing is we've been really focused on urban water. Your question's focused on urban water. But of course, the largest user of water in California is agriculture. And agriculture also still has opportunities to conserve. And if we're able to get, for example, a 10% saving in agricultural water, I mean, that's pretty much as much water as we use in total for domestic water. So I'm not too pessimistic that we can deal with the problem, but we do need to think about the problem more carefully than we have in the past.
Yeah, and I would just add the big piece of that is if we can figure out how to grow the same amount of food with slightly less water, it would go a huge way to solving our short-term water crisis and deal with a lot of the growth, at least in the immediate future.
Let me ask one other, if I can.
I'll just add one part about the question, your first part about where are we going to get more water. We probably aren't going to get more water. We're going to have to use the water we have a lot smarter. And doing a lot of conservation measures reduces that demand. Even if we have more people, then we can accept that growth because everybody that's already there is using less through water efficient measures. But also, looking at water recycling, as Buzz mentioned, that can take care of a big part of our demand. So reusing water does a lot of that. So it's using the water we have locally more efficiently. That's part of that getting more.
So we've got a long, I'm really sorry, sir, we had a long line of people who want to ask questions. We'd be happy to talk to you afterwards.
This question is for Tom. What fraction of Stanford's energy comes from renewables as opposed to natural gas and other fossil fuels, which many believe the approximate cause of the drought and water shortage? And is this an area Stanford should be a leader in?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'm not on the energy side, so I don't have statistics about our energy source. Obviously, when we were generating our own power, burning natural gas, that's non-renewable resource, so that was pretty much 100%. The new energy plant is going to be a lot more efficient, so we'll need less electricity, but we are running chillers with electricity. The sources of the electrical power that we're going to import now are really being scrutinized so that they are from more sustainable renewable sources than the typical portfolio that you see. So we're making a big move not only to get that power cost effectively, and there's some pretty good solar systems that are generating a lot of power right now that we can tap, but also in an environmentally sensitive way.
I think we're over on this side for a few questions. I think these people were up first.
One of the things that you talked about was the how cheap water is. I'm from the San Francisco Bay Sierra Club, and I'm on the water committee, and we've been kind of working closely with East Bay Mud, which serves 1.3 million customers and gets most of its water from the McCollum. They are in the process of implementing new drought rate structures. They went out to the community and they had input and worked with their staff and are pretty much ready to implement that, but they're looking at their long-term budget. When you conserve water, you bring in less revenue. And many localities are faced with infrastructure problems. So my question is, how does Prop 218 relate to rate structure for regular budgets for water agencies? Because there's a lot of controversy around how can agencies increase water rates and still meet Prop 218 regulations? And I haven't heard a lot of answers to that.
So I'm glad you asked an easy question. And I'll confess there's not an easy answer to that question. I mean, there's two problems with Prop 218. One is and for people that don't know, Prop 218 was a law that established rules for when local governments could raise taxes, different types of fees assessed against their citizens. In the wake of Proposition 13, many communities started just increase a variety of fees to make up for the loss of property taxes. So Proposition 218 was meant to backfill that and make it harder for local governments to raise fees, and there have been a series of decisions that apply that proposition to water rates. So there's two problems. One is the hoops that a community has to jump through in terms of getting voter approval, and the second is what you can actually spend the money on. And both are, I don't have easy answers to either question, except to say that dealing with Prop 218 is extremely difficult, and really reforming water rates in a way that's smooth and effective and not extremely time-consuming would require some reform to Proposition 218, I think. Yeah, I mean, that's the bottom line.
There's one other thing your question raised, which I think is an important thing to point out. Historically, in droughts, one of the things that we have done is the drought comes along. We encourage everybody to save water. But as you pointed out a moment ago, if you save water, but you still have the overall costs of running your system, then what do you have to do? You have to raise everyone's rates. And so you've told everyone they need to conserve, they conserve, and then you say, thanks for conserving, we're now going to raise your rates. And a lot of people get very upset at that stage. As a result, one of the things that a number of us have been encouraging cities to think about is drought pricing, where when it looks like you're going to have a drought, you have an explicit policy that you raise your prices at that particular point in time. You're going to have to do this probably anyway at some point in time. And if you do it at the very outset and say, hey, this is specifically to help address the drought, it also has the advantage that it encourages everyone to actually engage in the maximum amount of conservation.
Thank you. So I think these two gentlemen are next, and then we switch to that side of the room. I think that was the order they got up in.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me?
No.
Is this better?
That's
Yeah,
much better.
I hear it now. Okay. So Professor Thompson showed a picture of bottled water being distributed to people in the Central Valley, I believe. And and the reason given was that their wells were dry. And I've heard that there was also a need to distribute bottled water in the Central Valley because the water was polluted by things like fracking and agricultural runoff. Is that true as well?
So the Central Valley does have significant water quality problems. The major water quality problem there is the nitrates that is in the agricultural runoff water that then pollutes the groundwater. And there have been situations where we have had to distribute bottled water because of the quality of the water itself. One thing that we don't have a particularly good grasp on, but is how many people in the state of California do not have adequate access to safe drinking water. You would think that in a nation like the United States, that would not be an issue. But the minimum estimate I've heard is that there's something in the nature of 250,000 people in California that do not, in even a normal year, have adequate access to safe drinking water. And that's another problem that we need to address.
Sir. Okay, all right.
All right, this question, I guess, is for Daniel. I'm curious about the kind of broader climatological context of the drought. Specifically, I've kind of noticed that while we haven't been getting hardly any precipitation out here, they've been getting walloped with it in the east with the polar vortexes and whatnot and these blizzards. And is that just a coincidence, or is there something bigger going on?
Yeah, so it's really funny. I think there was a very similar question last year. Because last year, in that sense, looked a whole lot like this year, where it was warm and dry out west and really cold and snowy and stormy in the eastern part of the continental United States. And the most direct answer to that is they are connected, at least in a proximal sense. And when you get this big ridge out west, this big poleward deflection of the storm track that's led to the low precipitation and the warm temperatures in California, that jet stream has to come back south somewhere, and where it's been coming back south is right over the middle of the continent. And so when you're on the east side of that, which has, over the past couple of winters, been the eastern seaboard and all the major cities on the east coast of the United States, that brings all that cold Arctic air down from a really high latitude. And so to the extent that something is causing the ridge, it's also the same something that's causing this big trough on the other side of the country. And that's actually something that we're looking at right now in our research group, is what might actually, being more specific about the causes of this really sort of amplified anomalous pattern that extends really all the way across the continent.
Thank you.
So Daniel, is it true that just as we now talk about the ridiculously resilient ridge, they talk about the tenaciously truculent trough?
My understanding is that the climate scientists on the East Coast has given it the terribly tenacious trough.
Tenacious
trough.
But it's it's the alliteration that they got going.
Okay. And so the actual conditions that are leading to both the ridge and the trough, those the immediate causes of those, you don't have a grasp on yet.
Yeah, I mean, there's sort of an emerging picture that a large contributor is likely to be unusual ocean conditions in the Pacific. And the real question then is what's causing those unusual ocean conditions in the Pacific. So we can keep going back down the chain of causality, which is a very interesting question, but something we're actively taking a look at right now. And others are too, of course.
Thank you.
Daniel, go ahead, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Over there.
My concern is not simply about California, but drought, heat, extreme weather on the whole planet. Our drought is bad. It's been 4 years. The mega droughts back in the 1900, 1800, 850 to 1100 were much longer, but not as intense. Sana'a in Yemen, they get water supplies delivered once a week if they're lucky for 2 or 3 hours. Sao Paulo, Brazil is in deep trouble. Their reservoir is very low and there is no rain, particularly in the near future. And I don't know how that huge city is going to survive. I read that the Union of Concerned Scientists says that the Sierra snowpack will probably be reduced by 25% by maybe 2050 and maybe 70 or 90% by 2100. The International Energy Agency is very concerned that if we don't limit our carbon use by 2017, we'll have all of the carbon infrastructure that will push us over 2 degrees centigrade by 2035. The World Bank and the International Monetary Fund are very concerned that we will increase temperature by 3 or 4 degrees centigrade by 2060. I heard a lecture by Stephen Chu last year. He said 4, 5, 6 degrees is non-adaptable bad. So I want to ask a really hard question, and when I've asked this before, I get people laughing. What are we going to do about a 1,000-year drought? We're looking at a climate change event that is going to push the planet to another place. And what all of you are doing on the small local level is really important, but it's like dealing with little things here as the tsunami is coming in our direction. It's as if we're just barely waking up. we've been asleep at the wheel, and all of a sudden we wake up and we realize, oh my God, we're about to go over a cliff. We have to address that issue of not going over the cliff. And the only way I can see, but I'm open to ideas, is to mitigate our carbon emissions. And at the same time, we have to really ramp up solar, wind, geothermal, something that Mark Jacobson is working on here at Stanford. That switch is going to be very hard because we use 550 exajoules of energy from fossil fuels each year. And that is a number that I only have a vague idea of, but I know that the planet only produces 750 some odd exajoules from net primary production from plants. So that's where you get your energy from plants, is roughly 750, and we are using almost 2/3 of that from fossil fuels. We are living way beyond our means, and if we don't make an effort to sacrifice and do something about this, we're in deep trouble.
So, I mean, I'll start out. I don't know whether Daniel wants to talk about this from a scientific standpoint, but I would say that, you're absolutely right. That, right now we're dealing with a local issue, but in fact we have serious global challenges for water resources around the world. And in my view, there are two major aspects of that. The first one is climate change. And unless we're able to mitigate the problems of climate change, then I'm going to be really popular because I'm going to be flying all around the world helping people deal with their local water issues, right? And many of those water issues won't be solvable. There's a degree to which you can adapt and a degree to which you cannot. So that's the first issue. Second one is population growth. If you take a map of the world as to where water is the scarcest, and you take a map of the world and look to see where population growth is the highest, there's a very high correlation between those two factors. And so that's the second problem that really scares me when I look at it.
Yeah, I think I would add that, I think of the current event in California as sort of a really interesting case study, because it showcases what happens to a relatively, and at least in a global sense, a relatively well-prepared place that has capacity to adapt to a fairly extreme event, and just how large the impacts can be even when you do have those resources to do so. And the other interesting aspect of it is, this is the current drought in California is increasingly a temperature-driven event, and we know the temperatures have increased. So to a certain extent, at least some component of the current drought is representative of the kinds of droughts we'll see in the future, where it's really warm and also dry. It will continue to be dry sometimes and wet sometimes, but it's almost always going to be warmer. And so this sort of paints a picture of what it looks like when you have a drought and when it's very warm. And so in that sense, a hot drought like this is a bit of a taste of the future. And it's also interesting to point out that we can already quantify then the role that rising temperatures have had in increasing the risk of drought in a place like California. And that increase is already detectable. So to the extent that the climate has already changed due to human activities, we can already quantify that. And so it's, to a certain extent, it's not even something that's still in the future. It's something that's quantifiably in the present.
I'll just add a bit of a plug for where you're at right now, Stanford. We have a lot of world-renowned research going on in biological sciences, earth sciences, law. But we're not only researching and talking about what might be able to be done. I'm hoping that with a new energy plant and the water conserving and retrofitting and innovating that we're doing, we're walking that talk and practicing what we preach too. And that's what we can do. I'm hoping we can do, and we are doing all we can do. And it'll be enough, we'll see, but we're doing what we can.
All right, so we're at our 8:30 mark here. I think all the speakers went over, so we'd like to take a few more questions and not hog it for the speaker. So just keeping in mind that we're at 8:30, I'll try to, if everybody can ask quick questions, we'll try to get everybody. If we have a long discussion, we might have to cut off some of the people who are standing, but let's give it a shot.
I think this probably goes to almost entirely to Daniel, but feel free to chip in. And it's basically more of those last two sets of comments you gave, and it's the root cause question. Is you've already commented on oceans changing and currents across the oceans, and pick on the Pacific in our case, and the global thermal input into that. We sure don't hear an awful lot about El Nino and La Nina anymore for whatever reason. But behind there's an engine of some form with some relationship to the atmosphere in the oceans. It's the root cause question. I know it's easy to say it's complicated, but take a shot, if you would, at opening that door from current science as we at Stanford think about it, as scientists around the world and IPCC are thinking about it. How does that all fit together based on our current knowledge?
Sure. Well, so it probably comes as no surprise that it's a lot easier to talk about the proximal cause of a drought, to talk about the most immediate thing that resulted in the low precipitation, this big ridge, than why the ridge is so persistent and why it's there with such prominence in the first place. And I did mention it's a topic of some ongoing work that it is complicated, but I won't end there. So as I mentioned, that there are several hypotheses for what might be causing sort of this persistent ridge. Typically, when you see persistent phenomena in the atmosphere, there has to be a signal with something equally persistent in the ocean, because the ocean is essentially, on a somewhat fundamental level, it has more memory, has more temporal constancy than the atmosphere does. And so when you see something that lasts a really long time in the atmosphere, usually that's a signal that's actually coming from somewhere in the ocean. That's not always true, and part of what makes it really complicated is that there's never really, in any geophysical sense, a singular cause for any physical event. It's almost always a superposition of different physical causes. So to say it's the ocean could actually mean that there's really different things going on in the ocean in different places. One of the hypotheses is that the tropical West Pacific in particular has been very warm in the last decade or so, but particularly in the last couple of years. And that's a part of the Pacific that we know has a large influence on California climate. The tropics typically do in terms of California precipitation. Another emerging hypothesis is that there are changes in the high latitudes as well with respect to land snow cover and sea ice in the Arctic. And there is something of an open question as to the degree to which these changes in the high latitudes, which are occurring very quickly over the last decade or so, remarkably quickly, much more so than elsewhere on the planet, are influencing the weather in sort of remote regions, or geographically remote regions, meaning that regions that aren't remote from our perspective, the ones in the mid-latitudes where a lot of people actually live. And so that's another possible contributor. And the reality is, the most likely answer is that it's all of these things in some degree, but it's still not really clear which is dominant. And so I don't really have a concrete answer for you, but stay tuned.
That was a lot better than it's complicated, though.
Yeah,
it was, yeah.
It was a complicated way of saying it's complicated.
It seems to me that there is a very large, untapped new source of water that California could use. The Columbia River, which is at the border of Oregon and Washington State, discharges into the Pacific Ocean more than 3 times the total consumption of water in California. I don't understand why we can't tap that source with pipes, maybe across Oregon into Shasta Lake, or even offshore, if you can't get permits, into Shasta Lake. That would eliminate our problem.
So the short answer to that is it's really expensive to do that, and more expensive than other sources of water we have available to us. That's the bottom line on long distance transport of water from other sources.
Given what's been said about the changing climate, can you anybody who wants to take it on, talk something about the tunnels that the governor wants to build. And then it was touched upon briefly, but what would be the viability of building dams at this point?
Okay, just really quickly in terms of the tunnels, I think that most that most of the scientists working in the Delta system believe that there is no way that we can effectively protect the ecology of the Delta so long as we are taking the water through and out of the Delta itself. So that basically leaves us with two options. We either don't take any water out of the Delta anymore and take it to Southern California, which is probably a highly unlikely scenario, or it's the tunnels. With respect to the tunnels would permit us to actually go in and restore some of the Delta functioning. But it all depends on being able to ultimately limit how much water is taken through the system and down to Southern California. And part of the concern is until we actually have safeguards to ensure that we're going to limit how much water is taken out through the Delta, do you want to permit the tunnels to be built? That's the major environmental debate at the moment. There's also, I think, a question on cost as to whether or not 2 tunnels is cost effective. I think 1 tunnel is, second one is more marginal.
Just to clarify, so the diversion that you referred to is to Southern California would not be used for agriculture in the Central Valley?
No, it would be used for, I'm talking about anything south of the Delta in that particular answer. So I think probably something of that nature is needed, but we have to think about how we can provide effective guarantees with it and make sure that it's actually cost effective and that the people who are getting the water south of the Delta are going to be willing to pay for the cost of that tunnel system. We'll see with respect to the new reservoirs. I think the Sites reservoir, there are some numbers that would suggest it probably would make economic sense, at least to build that particular reservoir. It's more questionable on the other, and we'll see whether any of the major new reservoirs that are proposed ever get built. I think it'll be an interesting question.
All right, last question, please.
All right, really quick, last question of the night. What about water rights? How can private companies like Nestle's come in here and pump out water and sell it? And we don't have water and they're sending it. And then how do these fracking companies come in and they're using tons of water to frack and then they're contaminating water? How is this happening today?
Leon and I are looking at each other because we're probably the ones that are going to answer the question. So, do you want to take?
So I mean, on bottled water, I mean that there are places where withdrawal of water for bottling has had acute local impacts, for sure. In terms of the total amount of water that's used, it's a tiny, tiny percentage. So there are places where people have pumped springs and there have been local impacts, but in terms of the overall water management picture, Nestle's and bottled water isn't really a big part of it. So I dealt with bottled water. You can now deal with fracking.
Yeah. So no, I mean on the fracking side,
bottled water part in there because the fracking is the more important issue,
well,
right?
I'm actually not sure.
What happened to the clean water right? I thought we all have a right to clean water. This company comes in, they're contaminated water. They just reported last week in the LA Times that several of these the sources have been oh, they didn't know what's in it. We can't tell you.
Yeah. Although actually, so and this is a very long topic, but most of the studies that have looked at fracking nationwide, they have found contamination by to the degree of fracking gas. It's the natural gas itself that is contaminating the water, not actually the fracking liquids. There's very little evidence nationwide that you're getting contamination from the fracking liquids.
It was the chemicals, 2 watersheds near the LA area.
I'm not saying it doesn't occur, and that we don't need to deal with it, but it's somewhat like the problem of the bottled water. I don't think we should overstate the seriousness of the water problem from fracking. Would you disagree with that?
I came from the East, and I will say, there's lots of different, the level of precaution taken while fracking by gas companies, there's a huge amount of variability. And one of the issues that certainly happened in West Virginia and Pennsylvania is that the fracking boom there happened so quickly as it completely overwhelmed the regulatory capacity of those states to deal with it. And there were lots of well pads that weren't inspected, and there were lots of operators that came in and didn't have the same, take the same care that others did. And so there's, and again, I'm not an expert in fracking, and I don't know the full gradient of safety associated with fracking. I think that's still a big open question. But what I do know for sure is that there is wide variability among companies. I think it's getting a little bit better, but to avoid what, one of the big problems in the East was how quickly it happened and how poorly prepared the states were to deal with it. That much is for sure.
There is a new faculty member at Stanford, by the way, who's done a lot of work on fracking when he was at Duke, and he's now here and he's continuing the research. And that's Robert Jackson, who's a new professor in the School of Environmental and Energy, Earth and Energy.
Buzz and I need to be trained on this.
Yeah. So anyway, I would really encourage you to look at his particular webpage, because he really, this is one of his central focuses. And he's doing very detailed studies of this particular problem. And I feel somewhat uncomfortable of saying anything about it, because again, this is not my area from a scientific standpoint. From a regulatory standpoint, it is something that we should definitely care about, pay attention to. And historically, I'll just say the final thing, historically we've done a much better job protecting our surface water from contaminants than groundwater from contaminants. And it's an area that I think all states need to pay greater attention to. As I say, I don't stay awake at night worrying about this particular one compared to other things, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be regulating it effectively.
Well, let's thank our panelists and thank all of you for participating.